What happens when you cross the atmosphere of Silent Hill, the mechanics of Resident Evil, and combine them with some Lovecraftian undertones? The answer might be Signalis. It's a little like the original Silent Hill, except replace the car with a ship, Cheryl's her missing crewmate, and Harry's played by a Blade Runner replicant if they had the aesthetics of Metal Gear Rising. As for what Signalis is, the answer is that it's a sci-fi survival mixed with action and a gameplay loop that mostly revolves around exploration, combat, and simple but engaging collect items and keys puzzles. With a few notable exceptions, but that's neither here nor there. Signalis is the brainchild of two-member development team Rose Engine Games and was made over the span of about 8 years and finally was released in October of 2022. The gameplay itself borrows from Resident Evil and Silent Hill, as I mentioned, while the story takes inspiration from a few different sources, including the King in Yellow being a recurring motif to the point of showing up a few times throughout the game. Then there's the atmosphere being closer to a mix-up between alien CRT monitor sci-fi and Cold War-era Eastern Germany, including extensive use of both German and Mandarin alongside English to really hammer and sickle that point home. The premise of the story isn't too far off from my opening comparison, having the main character, Elster, a combat engineer design replicant, wake up from cryosleep aboard a scout vessel used in searching for habitable worlds, only to find that the place is absent of life and the ship itself has crash-landed on some ice world. Having some degree of amnesia, the stoic replicant is spurred on by some mysterious signal on a computer in a compound beneath the ice that alludes to some promise that she needs to keep. The story's kept somewhat vague for a good majority of Signalis, but that's to its credit, and it's very much one of those make sense in hindsight kind of experiences. Although that's not to say that it lays out everything clear as day for the player, favoring instead to let you piece things together for yourself as you get a grasp of the world, which feels very lived in and has an extensive literature scattered throughout the game that you can find. Suffice to say, it's a very story-rich game, and going too deeply into that would spoil the mystery and satisfaction of figuring it out firsthand. Some of the journals or scraps of information can offer more literal advice, however, my favorite being one that you find very early in the game. Kick 'em while they're down! 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 Sorry. With that segue, I think we can safely move on to the gameplay. Signalis plays a bit more closely to the original Resident Evil titles, with the exception of being in an isometric mode rather than with static or cinematic camera positions. Other than that difference, the tried and true mantra of explore, get items for puzzles or keys for doors, and fight or flight from enemies to the best of your ability remains much the same. Combat itself can feel a bit finicky on controller, especially with the way that Elster will opt for pushing away closer enemies, which makes those moments of you being backed into a corner or trying desperately to fend off attackers feel especially terrifying. Add on to the fact that aiming takes time, either having the reticle crossed out to say that you'll miss, or slowly tightening up to deal a more precise, higher damaging shot. This offers a give and take between spamming in a panic and taking a more methodical shots to preserve ammo. And while the most favourable method would likely be to avoid fights in the first place, sometimes they're simply unavoidable, either with too many enemies or with how fast and aggressive the monsters can get. Signalis leans into this, putting an emphasis on the exploration and avoiding enemies indirectly by the bias it has in favour of dishing out health pickups towards the player, more so than ammunition or other combat items. This, combined with Elster regaining a portion of her health over time, further incentivizes the style of gameplay, while not entirely removing the option of going ham and blasting every Randy J that you come across. Hell, in some places this would even be advisable, especially if it's somewhere you're bound to traverse through multiple times, like outside of safe rooms or near elevators and the like. You can even get Thermite, which serves the purpose of kerosene from RE1, letting you fry enemies after putting them down to ensure they don't get back up again. Or you can use the flare gun, which has the same effect after stumping them while they're down, stumping them with it. Sorry. A quick word of advice on the flare gun, don't be like me and skip over reading the description of ammo. I completely missed the part where this thing could be loaded with HE shells if you combine them in your inventory manually. So I spent my first playthrough wondering where the grenade launcher is when I had it the whole time. Which only sucked even more when I learned just how good this thing is in a following playthrough. It's an absolute beast. My own stupid folly aside, I only have two main issues when it comes to the enemies. The first being how tedious the boss fights in this game can feel, with the first being a giant slow miner that takes ages to wind up an attack, and it basically results in hiding behind a cabinet, killing any other monsters that show up, and waiting until it opens up its weak spot for you to peek out and shoot it a few times. Then repeat this like 5 more times. It was a little scary at the first time around, but as soon as I learned this loop, it's just hide, wait, shoot, hide, wait, shoot. It got really boring really fast. The second boss isn't too much better, since you just unload your entire arsenal into it until it dies, and it can't really be a credible threat to the player, but at least it doesn't make me wait around artificially bored the whole time. The second issue is that enemies will hang around for a bit wherever it is that you leave them when going through doors. So if you rush through a room, realize it's a dead end filled with nothing but more enemies, you'll want to go right back through that door that you came through. Except, because Elster walks along a set path when going through doors, it'll often walk right into enemies and take damage since there's no iframes during this animation. And more times than I can count, Elster would walk into an enemy, I'd then gain control after being hit, and then immediately get hit again, or twice even, before I can safely get away from them. It's a minor annoyance, but I quickly started referring to it as the health tax since I'd be screwed either way. The passive health regen only works to a certain point and takes a bit of time to work as well, so it's either wait around for a bit to let it refill or dip into those health supplies. Thankfully, like I said, the game's pretty generous when it comes to handing them out, but it's still aggravating to take basically guaranteed damage in the first place. The opening section on the crashed scout ship, then the first level of the mining complex, does a decent job as serving as a tutorial. The former involving the player interacting with objects, combining items in your inventory to repair your only means of leaving the ship, as well as introducing you to one of the other ways of interacting with the world that shows up from time to time, wherein you'll sometimes shift from that isometric view to first person, allowing you to explore some interiors or interact with certain puzzles in a more close-up fashion. I actually rather enjoyed these parts whenever they did show up, having the same kind of charm as a 90s FMV game or something, while also allowing for more in-depth interactions with the puzzles, even if it's just as basic as swiping an access key card or working an electric lockpick. Then later it lets you walk around in these first-person FMV style sections, such as introducing the mechanics of the radio, that then becomes essential for solving some puzzles and even defeating a certain enemy type that blocks your path now and then. This can lead to some pretty tense moments of trying to avoid or fight other enemies while fiddling with the radio, trying to desperately take care of these roadblocks. I have to say that I enjoyed pretty much all of the puzzles in this game, finding they have the right level of difficulty without leaving the player feeling lost or stumped for too long. Most just requiring some logical deduction or a little trial and error like the fuse box or managing the water levels to unflood a lower floor. The only one that I personally struggled with would have to be the very last one that's just before the game's final boss encounter, which I guess is appropriate since it's the last roadblock, but I felt it wasn't too clear on what it wanted me to do or how to carry out what it did want me to do in the first place. I could also understand if the radio overstays its welcome for some players, but I personally enjoyed its level of involvement since Signalis features quite a few obstacles that need to be solved using it, most of the time being wall saves, which start off rather easy enough, but soon adds a layer of complexity to it by requiring a cipher to translate the numbers into letters later on. Another contentious point would likely be the item limit, given that Elster can only carry 6 items at once, whether that be a single bullet, a full stack of ammo, a key card, or a giant anti-material rifle. They all take up the same amount of space. This completely hamstrings the exploration and leads to a lot of back and forth between the safe points to drop off gear into your red box that can and did get pretty tedious at times. You can't drop anything, only destroy items to make room if you're full or put them in your red box as mentioned, which can get really annoying. What's worse is that the game lets you automatically reload ammo into a carried gun if you're full on inventory space, but it doesn't let you use any healing items you come across, which just feels like a real oversight. I'm also on the fence about the fact that the time doesn't pause when you interact with objects, so trying to open or unlock a door can be pretty tense trying to button mash through the dialogue while an enemy is creeping up to clap my cheeks. It sure does add to the tension, but it can also lead to a few frustrating scenarios where it pops up when I don't mean it to. In Signalis, you have 2 main slots, your primary for weapons, then an item slot. which can be things like healing items, the flashlight, an eyeball that takes photographs or an in-game way of recording puzzle clues, or a stun prod that can hit multiple enemies if they bunch up close enough. This is actually a pretty useful feature, but can get a little finicky if you have multiple items in your inventory fighting for its space and need to switch back and forth between them. The big upside to having the auto-injector equipped though is the fact that it'll be consumed when you otherwise die, so it serves as an auto-revive. And this could be really useful for a couple of spots later on in the game where there'll be tons of enemies guarding important items needed to progress the plot. So instead of wasting a bunch of ammo, just equip one of these and face tank the damage without fear of a game over. Which, speaking of, there's a pretty noticeable difficulty spike about halfway through the game. The first half feels easy in comparison, but then suddenly the amount of enemies really ramps up and the resource management can get pretty tight in places. This can result in situations where you'll explore for a bit, then backtrack to stock up on more supplies since you've run dry on whatever weapon you were carrying, which can then lead to dead enemies getting back up and potentially wasting even more ammo or healing items. And it might just be crazy, but I'm pretty sure the thermite can sometimes not work as intended, since this one enemy in particular has gotten up 4 separate times after doing it. What? Aesthetically, I really like the look of Signalis, with the lived-in feeling of the setting and the attention to detail to sprites lending a level of authenticity to the environment and characters. Even if it did take a little getting used to for the anime-style look of the characters, I think it was the right choice in the end. All in all, I also think that there was just the right level of anti-aliasing that was used to make things clear, while also having that kind of hard-edged sci-fi look and communistic aesthetic that Signalis was going for. The same can definitely be said for the sound design, taking cues from Silent Hill, especially when it comes to that cacophony of noise whenever an enemy is alerted to Elster's presence. It really goes a long way of racking up the feeling of tension, even if I would feel relatively safe in avoiding a monster otherwise. It would give me pause in a moment of concern. The rest of the soundtrack also suffers the same success in setting the tension or atmosphere, really effectively pulling off the creep factor in a meaningful way. I'm not very good at describing music or sound design that well, probably from being hearing impaired and tone deaf, but I know what I like when I hear it, and Signalis definitely has the merit to mostly achieve what it sought out to with its score. The only exception is the sound for using items is a bit off. I don't know what it is, but it sounds a little sus. In conclusion, Signalis is a horror sci-fi throwback that has a focus on explorative gameplay, the right amount of tension and diversity in its monsters, even if 2 out of the 3 boss fights are pretty underwhelming or straight up disappointing. It more than makes up for this shortcoming in its story, even if the different achievable endings have varying levels of downer to them, being appropriate given its Lovecraftian influence. I'll refrain from speaking about it at length to avoid spoiling the story, but it's delivered in such a way as to make it sense, but mostly in hindsight or during a second playthrough, as it doesn't lay out every detail on your lap, and leaves some things ambiguous or up for speculation. Overall, I would say it's a fulfilling experience. Also, good luck if you plan on unlocking the secret ending without a walkthrough, since that thing is beyond esoteric in how you go about unlocking it. And honestly though, it isn't too bad if you skip going for it entirely, since even that ending is debatable on whether or not it's the quote-unquote best ending. They're all pretty subjective. Story aside, the gameplay loop is solid and enjoyable, if perhaps an over-reliance on radio-based puzzles at parts for some people. Signalis is definitely a solid sci-fi horror entry that I would wholeheartedly recommend to just about anyone interested, with it entirely being worthwhile even at its full asking price. As always, cheers for watching, keep on smiling, and I'll see you all in the next video.